the recording. David, go ahead.
Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everybody, and in particular our guest speaker for today. She's Jean Dougherty. She's currently the chairperson of the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, and she was the chief curator for the Geological Survey of Canada for about a decade. Spent most of her career there, about 37 years, and retired in 2013. Been working on things related to K-Core, the environment, and geology in the last few years, and she's going to talk to us today about Canada's history through the lens of the Geological Survey's photographs. Welcome, Jean. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Dave, and thank you everyone for attending this talk. I know that the title was a bit vague, and basically Dave has summarized it by saying that I'm going to be looking at Canada's history literally through the lenses of the people who worked at the Geological Survey of Canada. Every photograph and map that you're going to see are available through the Geological Survey of Canada on their digital databases, with the exception of a couple of photographs that I took and organized when I was working as the curator at the survey. So with that, this particular talk is going to be organized in time slices, if you will, looking at basically the late 1800s, from 1900 to 1950 or so, and from the latter half of the 1900s. It's time slices, but the major portion of the talk is actually going to be spent on the early stuff, because it's really, really important to understand the GSC and what I'm going to be talking about in Canadian history and how important the geology was to our history. The Geological Survey of Canada was formed in 1842. It was formed after the rebellions of Upper and Lower Canada in the late 1830s, and Lord Durham suggested that the province of Canada be formed by the union of the two previously then colonies that were separate. And one of the first acts of the government of the day in the province of Canada was to fund for a couple of years the Geological Survey of Canada to make a survey of the province. Now, most of the time when we talk about a survey, we're talking about looking at the rocks that are there. This is what we think about today. But in that particular time period, what they were actually trying to do was figure out what was out there, because everything, most of it was wilderness. So you have to remember that this was a time period quite a long time ago. It was 175 years ago. At that time, just to give you some context as to what was going on scientifically worldwide, the formation of the GSC was approximately halfway between two seminal events in British history, in particular of the sciences. William Smith produced the first geologic map of Britain and published it in the late 1800s, actually. And it was a map that he produced looking at the geology because he was a canal builder. And he was one of the first people who recognized the importance of the geology in making it easier for him to build a canal and drain the waters that were causing problems and so on. So he recognized the importance of the rocks and the fossils to tell him where to go and how to do it. And in 1859, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species. And in that time period, in the middle of that, was when the GSC was formed. So it gives you some context in that. And at that time, geology was a very young science. Charles Lyell published the Principles of Geology in 1830. This was one of the major works that Charles Darwin took with him on the voyage of the Beagle, because it helped him understand looking at, well, he was doing the surveys that he did on the Beagle. So this is giving you some context there. At that time, the province of Canada was in fact the hewers of wood, drawers of water, hunter, fishers, trappers, lumberjacks, and farmers. We were not a particularly industrialized economy. We were, the people of the day were having an industrial economy. They wanted to know where things like and in particular coal resources were located. so that they could have an industrial economy similar to what was happening in Britain at the time. It was the dawn of the industrial age. It was the beginning of the reign of Queen Victoria. So all of this was very, very important to the people of the day. And it was very much an Anglo-centric colonial society. We were managed by a colonial governor from Britain. We were not at any time, at that stage, we were not really in charge of our own destiny, as it were. And we wanted to build, we, the people of the province of Canada, wanted to build a modern economy. And one of the things that happened with Sir William, the first director of the Geological Survey, was a man by the name of William Logan, and you'll see a lot more about him in the next few slides. But what we recognized was that coal was not found in the province of Canada, and I'll explain in some detail later why. And it was one of the major driving forces behind the formation of the Dominion of Canada in 1867. And I'd like you to note the fact that 1867 was 25 years after the GSC was formed. So at the time at the province of Canada, the province of Canada were basically these two packets of land that were right along the coast of the St. Lawrence River and up around the Great Lakes, around Toronto region, that sort of in there. And mostly what we were looking at, people here were farmers mostly. And in this particular region, in what was then the Upper Canada, or sorry, in Lower Canada, the main wealth from that actually was derived trading industry. Up in what this region that's called Rupert's Land was actually the territory of the Hudson's Bay. And this area here was the territory of the Northwest Company. So those are two very important things in the early days of Canadian history. But the GSC was formed because they didn't know anything about the lands except right along the lands of the St. Lawrence River. So before we keep going on, I'd like to explain a couple of terms that I'll be using quite frequently through the talk. One of them is mapping, and basically it's a very simple concept. It's trying to determine what rock you have in what location and putting that point on a map. Sounds really simple, but it's pretty complicated, and it's very important for the work that was being done. And in particular, you have to know the age of the rock, and so that you can understand the processes that actually happen to cause the rock to be where it is. It's pretty simple stuff. And on any geologic map, especially the ones that you're going to see today, the colors that you see represent different ages of rock. That's basically all you need to know. So also, the other concept that I want you to understand is this concept of biostratigraphy. It's made up of two words, bio meaning biology or life. Stratigraphy are the basic layers of rock that you're looking at. And the Earth's history can actually be divided up into time periods that are denoted by the kinds of fossils that are found in them. Fossils are the remains of what were once living things. And in the geologic record, we have these time periods. I refer to this very simply as Precambrian. Precambrian is the time of Earth's history where there are not very many fossils in the rock. And then something happened 540, 550 million years ago, where all of a sudden we started to get fossils in the sedimentary rocks. And each of these time periods that are mentioned here on this column that are given names, Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian. These are chapters in the Earth's history where particular fossils are only found at that time, and we can figure out how old the rock is by the fossils that it contains. You also have to realize that all of these chapters in the Earth's history, these are relative time scales. It was only after the Second World War, when you had the advent of radiometric dating methods, that we were able to put these absolute years on the side of it. So up to that point, up until World War II, you were looking at relative time periods. It's fairly simple, but that's what you're looking at. So with mapping in Canada in the latter part of the 1800s, these people that I've listed here were critical in the history of the GSC. William Logan was the first director of the GSC. You'll see a lot more of his stuff going on. Elkanah Billings was the first paleontologist and the biostratigrapher who actually devised the biostratigraphic framework for the lower Paleozoic of Eastern Canada. Thomas Weston was the first museum preparator that they hired. George Dawson, Joseph Tyrrell, and Albert Lowe, and you'll get to see a lot more of these people in some detail as we're going through this. So William Logan was the first director of the GSC. He was born in Canada. He was born in the late 1700s, 1798 in Montreal. He was of a fairly well-to-do family in Montreal, and like many people of his day, he was sent back to Britain, to the old country, to have his education. So he was educated at the University of Edinburgh, and he was a fine arts, he got a classical education. He was taught how to draw, and he was a fine artist. Watercolors are particularly well worth looking at his stuff. And he really was not trained as a geologist at all. But what happened was he had an uncle who ran some coal mines in Swansea area of Wales. And he went to work with his uncle so he could understand the family business. And he began to look at the rocks and the minerals and the fossils and so on that he found associated with the coal beds. And this is quite common for well-to-do gentlemen of that time. They were not scientists per se, they were naturalists, and they found interest in the world around them. So he was a self-taught person in terms of his geology and his understanding. And this was basically through the 1830s, at about the same time that Charles Darwin had come back from the voyage of the Beagle. And he was part of that society of naturalists who were understanding what was going on. And the one thing about William Logan was that he began to understand what kind of rock and how old the rocks needed to be to find coal. He became an expert in coal. And in 1841, he just happened to be back in Canada visiting his family when the opening came for the Geological Survey of Canada. And he was hired at the behest of the British Geological Survey. The founder there was a friend of Logan's. And because this was a colonial government, he got the job. But he was exceptionally well placed to do this work. When he started to do the field work, he only had 2 or 3 years to get this work done. The grant was for £1,500 to do all this work of mapping and surveying the province of Canada. William Logan worked on the eastern part in the Gaspé region of Quebec. And he had an associate and assistant named Alexander Murray who did the mapping in what was Upper Canada area around York and places like that, what's now the southern peninsula of Ontario. So this is not a photograph that was taken by Logan, but it is of a village in the Gaspé region. And again, this is a per se rock. The yellow or the circle shows you what the rock looks like in the middle of the Bay of Fundy and in the mouth of St. Lawrence, excuse me. And that's what per se rock actually looks like in a more modern photograph. So these are photographs of Sir William Logan himself. The picture up in the top left corner is Logan sitting in his office in his good work clothes. He was well known for being he didn't really care too much about his appearance, and he really, really worked quite hard. And the lower right-hand corner is the picture taken of Logan at his retirement in 1871. And this was a picture that was taken just prior to his death in 1875. So these are pictures of Sir William Logan that were taken. He was a crotchety old man, but was well liked by his co-workers. And within a short period of time, within about 2 years, Logan recognized that there were no rocks of the appropriate age in the province of Canada that contained any coal. Now, coal is a rock that is made from the remains of what were once land plants that were found in swamp conditions. And areas like the Louisiana bayous and that sort of place, when you have a large amount of plant material that doesn't decompose, it gets collected, it dewaters, becomes peat, and then is gradually turned in with temperature and pressure. It's turned from peat into the various grades of coal, lignite, bituminous, and then anthracitic coal. And because it had to be land plants from which coal is derived, you have to have, plants did not invade the land in the Earth's history until the Devonian, which was approximately about late Silurian, early Devonian, and it was much younger than all of the rocks that are found in the province of Canada. In particular, the sedimentary rocks that would have contained coal, it's all too old to contain real coal deposits. Now, the other thing about Logan was he was quite a good promoter of the GSC and the importance of the work that was being done. So he was able to show, because of the fact that he was able to show the importance of the coal deposits and the fact that we didn't have any, he was able to get additional funding for an additional 5 years of surveying work. And he kept doing the work through hiring on of various people through this time period to help him with the work. And what he also found was one of the ways to promote this was to actually to make up a museum for the people of Canada so that the public could understand what was going on with this work. So he started the museum collections that actually eventually became the museums, all the science museums that we have in Canada, Canadian Museum of Nature, Canadian Museum of History, and the Canadian Science and Tech Museum are all daughter organizations of the Geological Survey of Canada. And their original collections were ones that were taken by the geologists and people who were out doing the surveying work. So Logan was able to, by the end of his career, he was able to prove that the GSC was an important aspect of work that was being done. We had permanent funding as an organization so that we would continue in, not necessarily in perpetuity, but it's beginning to look that way. And he was also able to show that because of the lack of coal that we had, excuse me, in the province of Canada, this was one of the major aspects that actually was part of the confederation of the country. So to form the Dominion of Canada. So before his retirement, he published in 1863 a book called The Geology of Canada. And in that book, there was, along with that, he published this map, a small map that was published in 1864 showing the state of the knowledge of the day. And you can see how vague everything is in this region. He recognized in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia all of the different rock types that were necessary for coal deposits, etc. And coming through here, everything is pretty vague. And then down in this region, you're looking at the sedimentary rocks, and coming around here, the information that is recorded on this map out here comes from basically the fur traders and the people that had gone out before him. But we don't know an awful lot about Canada. So to make it look better, he included a lot of the stuff from the United States because that was better known at the time. So the thing about Logan was in the 1850s, as I said, he was a good promoter. He actually took a large demonstration samples over to the World Exhibition at the Crystal Palace in London, showing the kinds of rocks that we have in Canada and the importance of what kind of industrial products could come from that. He also took, in 1855, he took material over to the exhibition in Paris. And as a result of the work that he had done there, he was knighted by Queen Victoria in 1856, and he was given the Legion of Honor, French Legion of Honor, because of the importance of the displays that he was able to take over. And these displays were things that were actually being put on display in Canada as well for the people so that they could understand the importance of the geology for their own development and economic growth. In 1998, Maclean's magazine, Maclean's magazine ran a contest, which they've done in the past, where they were looking at the most important scientist in Canadian history. And it was William Logan who was known to be, or is pronounced to be, the most important scientist in Canadian history. He was actually he outdid all of the Nobel Prize winners that we'd had since then. He also outcompeted Banting and Best for the discovery of insulin, things like that. It was William Logan who was named. And in addition to that, in 2003, the Principles of Geology that Logan published in 1863 was named one of the most important books in Canadian science history. So this is something that he did. Mount Logan in the southwestern part of the Yukon Territory, which is the highest mountain in Canada, was named after Logan, and that was named in 1898. So the work that Logan had done was instrumental in the formation of Canada as a country. The location of coal, the work that he did was fundamental to the going on of what happened. Elkanah Billings was the first paleontologist that was hired by Logan. He was hired in 1856. Billings is a son of Ottawa. He is the son of Bradish Billings of Billings Estate that is well known in the Ottawa region. For those people who aren't from Ottawa, I'm sorry, but anyway, that's the connection that I'm putting there. He was trained as a lawyer, and he actually did practice law up the Ottawa Valley. And eventually he was, again, another one of these people who was very interested in the world around him. And he became a self-taught paleontologist. He was fascinated by the fossils that he was seeing. And as I said, it was very important for them to understand the age of the rocks by identifying the fossils. So Elkanah Billings was the person that Logan hired to do this. And he was the person who established the biostratigraphic framework for Eastern Canada, so we could understand how and what kinds of rocks we have in this part of the region. And he identified thousands of specimens. He had hundreds of publications, which in that day and age was really quite an accomplishment, because it took enormous effort to make these publications. And this is a photograph that I took of several of the specimens that he actually identified and some of the publications that he had. And instead of using photographs as we do today for identifying and showing off the fossils that we've got, everything had to be drawn by hand. So this is an example of the fossil that is now known as Strophomena fluctuosa, and it's a brachiopod. This is the drawing, and this is the actual specimen. So you can see that and all through these publications, and some of them are hundreds of pages long with hundreds of specimens that have been drawn by hand on these plates. And it just took an enormous amount of work to be able to do this. So Billings was an important person in that time period. The first, as I said, Logan actually formed the museum so he could help educate the people of Canada to the importance of the geology there. And to actually do this, they had to hire somebody who could work in the museum. And the person they hired for this was a man named Thomas Weston. He was a lapidarist, and lapidary is actually the cutting and polishing of rocks so that you can actually see them and see what's in them more clearly. He also became an expert preparator of fossils. He was the museum assistant. He organized all of the displays. He helped make things understandable to people. He became a photographer, which in that day and age was really quite something. This was another feature that you're going to see through the presentation, I hope, that the GSC actually was trying to use new technologies to make their work easier. And photography was certainly one of those that helped them document what they were seeing when they were out in the field. Weston also became a field assistant, and he became the first GSC librarian. It also became evident that as people were coming through the survey, if they had access to all of the books that people had in their offices, so the personal libraries of the individual scientists were actually accumulated together as a library for everyone to use. And in fact, they still have some of the books of people like Elkanah Billings and William Logan. Their personal books are still in the GSC library, so they're available for people to look at. Now, some of the things that he did, this particular, I apologize for the fuzziness of this particular photograph here, but this is Weston standing in front of one of the fossils that he actually prepared for hanging in the museum in Montreal, where the museum was located at the time. And this is a map, this is a fossil called, a trace fossil called Climactic-nites. It was discovered by William Logan near Perth, Ontario, when he was actually doing his field mapping in the Ottawa Valley. And this particular fossil is still in the collections of the GSC. Unfortunately, the specimen itself fell off the wall. It's extremely heavy. It's rock that is, it broke into about 56 pieces, and we still have all of the pieces. And once in my career, I was asked to bring this particular specimen out for someone to examine, and it took us 4 days, and it took a whole hallway to get it out so that we could actually see and examine what was going on. It's a trackway that they think was made by a mollusk of some sort. Anyway, I just thought that was a really neat photograph. The other one, this is a photograph I took of specimens that Weston had prepared. These are rock thin sections, so you can see corals and stuff like that. We still have them. These are microscope thin sections of a variety of different things that he had actually prepared, fossils he'd mounted. And this particular example is of a pseudo fossil called Ezoa canadensis. I won't go into a lot of details, but that was another controversy that was back in the past that has been changed from there. As a photographer, he did go out in the field. He went at least as far west as the Cypress Hills in Saskatchewan. This photograph up in the left corner is one that he took, and also did work out in Quebec. So that's what you're looking at there. So Weston took these photographs, and you can see the work that he had done. The next person I want to talk about is George Dawson. George Dawson was quite an interesting character. He was born in Pictou County, Nova Scotia. His father, was William Dawson, and he was one of the first principals of the McGill University. William Dawson was a well-known paleontologist and had actually worked with some of the very famous fossil localities out in Nova Scotia, and one of the first people out there. And his son was educated in this discipline. At about the age of 12, he developed bone tuberculosis. It's a disease called Pott's disease. And as a result, he never grew beyond the size of a 12-year-old boy. So you can see a picture of Dawson sitting in a chair here. But in this one, in the top corner, you can actually see an element of his hunchback that he had. And this is a picture of Dawson working with his field crew in 1879. And this is taken at Fort Macleod in what's now Alberta. So you can see what his stature was like. But even though he had these limitations, physical limitations, he was a phenomenal geologist and field mapper. He was, in his early days, he was educated, actually he was one of the first geologists who was actually educated in geology. He had gone to the London School of Mines in England. And after he graduated from that, he came back to Canada, and he, in 1873 to 1875, he was part of the International Boundary Commission that were looking at where they are going to put the 49th parallel between the US and Canada, and put the boundary out basically from the Lake of the Woods, which is the western edge of the Great Lakes, through the mountains, and where you're through to BC and out to the coast. So where the 49th parallel runs. And as a result of the work that he had done on the 49th parallel, Dawson was hired into the GSC because in 1871, British Columbia was added to the Canadian Federation on condition that we would have a rail link from the west or from the east major center out to British Columbia. And so they knew that they had to run a rail line across the prairies and then through the mountains. So the GSC was part of the groups that went ahead of running through the rail lines when the rails were coming out, so that we could actually find the resources to make the rails possible, the railroad possible. So they were looking for water, they were looking for aggregate to make the rail beds, they were looking for forest products, as it were. They were also looking for coal, so they didn't have to haul all of this out from the various regions. In addition, they were also helping find the pathways, especially through the mountains, as to where this was going to go. So in 1879, you can see these pictures were taken of Dawson, by Dawson, at various places in Manitoba. And in this case, this is an indication of what was at that time Fort Edmonton, in what's now the provincial capital of Alberta. And this is a set of photographs that were taken by, both of them taken by Dawson, one of Fort Calgary here. And this is really quite interesting because as a native Calgarian, I found this is Nose Hill. You can see the Bow River there. The fort was built by the Northwest Mounted Police. They were sent out ahead of a lot of the settlers so that they could establish a fort and policing through this area. And Fort Calgary was built at the confluence of the Bow and the Elbow River. A couple of years later, so this picture was taken in 1881, this one was taken in 1887. In 1883, the CPR came through Calgary and the rail link was being made. And this is how many settlers had actually been managed to come out by this point. So Calgary was developing as a result of the railroad coming out. Now, as I had said earlier, this was very much a European-centric idea. And the Canadian way of doing things, they actually made treaties with various bands of Indigenous people prior to the railroad arriving. And in the case of Calgary, it was Treaty Number 7, and that was signed, and the people were put into reserves before that. I won't go into a lot of the details on that, but it's important to know that that was done with the policing and before the railroads came out. So how we handled our Indigenous people is all part and parcel of this story. Dawson, in addition to doing the work that he did across the prairies, he was also, after that was done, he was asked to do some mapping through British Columbia and into the Yukon territories. So with the mapping that they were doing, all of the geologists that were doing the mapping, they were restricted to the areas where there were transportation corridors. So you'll see that a lot of it was the railroads, but also up through the rivers and lakes that were part of the trading routes that people had in the past. So in Yukon in particular, this is a photograph taken of the Pelly River in the Yukon. And these are two photographs taken the same year of his, in this case, the Indigenous crews that helped guide him up these rivers, because there were very few European people who had been up this way. So he was working with a guy named R.G. McConnell. For those in Alberta, geologists in Alberta, the McConnell thrust, which is the first major thrust belt that shows the Rocky Mountains coming out, is named after him. And McConnell was the field assistant with George Dawson up in when he was going through BC and into the Yukon. So but the Indigenous people were the guides that they used. These scientists or these geologists that were doing the field work at this time, they were out for months at a time, if not years at a time. They could not take their food supplies with them. They had to learn how to live off the land. In addition to that, none of these people had base maps on which they could actually just put their plots. So they had to do the surveying themselves. And the way in which they did this was they would make their maps as they're going around the field. In the case of they go along the coasts, around the lakes, and they map out the coast and they'd move inland from there, as well as along the riverbanks. So it was very arduous work. And in particular, thinking of the stature of somebody like Dawson, literally his stature, how difficult this work would have been. But he succeeded. And he also, when he was working out on the West Coast, he became enthralled with and very much interested in the Haida culture and the West Coast Indians. And he took an enormous number of photographs. He documented their dress, he documented their buildings and their language. And he became known as the father of Canadian anthropology because of the work that he had done with the Haida out on the West Coast. This is a photograph that was taken by Dawson, and it's the inspiration for the decorations that are now part of the Canadian Museum of Man History, the great hall that we have in the museum here in the Ottawa region. So these were pictures that were taken by Dawson at the same time, showing the various totems, what the villages looked like, how the people lived, how they worked. This is, looking at the salmon drying racks that they had. So all of the work that he did, he was fascinated with this, and all of this information in these photographs came back, and they formed the foundation of the collections of the Canadian Museum of History. The next person I want to talk about is Joseph Tyrrell. Now, Tyrrell was an interesting character as well. He was also educated in Canada, and he was a lawyer. And when he graduated from law, they basically told him that his health was bad, so he had to spend more time outdoors. So he also became part of the GSC. He was interested and self-taught geologist and mapper. So he also joined the GSC early on. And I've shown this picture as a part of a segue because this was a picture photograph taken by Joseph Tyrrell of Dawson City in the Yukon during the Klondike in 1890. So this was in the late 1890s. So this is Dawson City, named after George Dawson. The work that Dawson had done through British Columbia and into the Yukon, the maps that he made were the maps that were used by the people of the Klondike to try and it resulted in the gold rush, both in the Yukon as well as the one that happened in southern BC in the Kootenay regions back in the late 1800s. So this was the segue that I had done, but it was a picture taken by Tyrrell. But Tyrrell's mapping area, he was actually sent out into what is referred to as the Barrens Lands, which is basically the area west of the Hudson's Bay, up through Nunavut into into the Arctic Ocean. And he was the second person who actually did the field mapping through this region. And he took a lot of photographs of the Indigenous people there. It was absolutely critical that he had good Aboriginal guides because there were very few people that had actually gone through here and done the kind of surveying that he was doing. So this is the area from he centered out of Churchill, but it was also the Hudson's Bay trading posts that were at the headwater or the edge of the large rivers that flowed into the Hudson's Bay that were bringing all of the pelts out to be shipped so they could be shipped up through the Hudson's Bay. And it was interesting here because at Churchill, Manitoba, near there is a photograph that Tyrrell took, and this says S. Hearn, July 1767. Samuel Hearn was an explorer that was hired by the Hudson's Bay Company to actually do some mapping and see if they could find some trackways that would allow them to get up to the Arctic and into northern Canada, into what's Nunavut, now Nunavut, to see if they could actually get some of the furs from that region. So Hearn was the first European that went through this area, and Joseph Tyrrell was the second who was actually doing the exploration, the surveying from this particular region. And again, he was in the area, he was working in the area of northern Manitoba and Nunavut, right around Churchill Bay. And I've shown this particular one because this was the Hudson's Bay Post, which is now in Saskatchewan. And this is where another one of the Indigenous treaties was signed. And that was the location where it was actually signed. These are all pictures that were taken by Tyrrell through Alberta. This is Edmonton. And then this particular one is showing Red Deer, Alberta. Now, all of these were in what was then referred to as the Northwest Territories. Alberta did not become a province. Alberta and Saskatchewan did not become provinces until 1905. So all of these would have been in what was then the Northwest Territories. The other reason why Tyrrell was very important is that he was one of the people that was sent out ahead of the railroads looking for coal in particular. And he was in the Drumheller region of the Red River Valley. And Drumheller is an area where there was a lot of coal that they were able to mine. And he was exploring through there, and he actually accidentally discovered the dinosaur beds in the Drumheller Valley. So they were discovered in the early 1870s at this point. And a lot of people, the dinosaur rushes that happened around the world, where many of the major museums came to places like Drumheller and took the specimens back to their institutions for examination and display. The Canadian Geological Survey eventually sent out their own field crews out to the Drumheller area. This particular picture was taken in the early 1900s by Charles Sternberg. The Sternberg family, the father and sons were the people that the GSC had that were collecting specimens so that the Canadians would manage to keep some of their patrimony. And these are the dinosaurs that are now on display in places like the Canadian Museum of Nature here in Ottawa. They were the founding specimens of the GSC of that particular museum. And the Royal Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology, which is now the big museum that's in Drumheller, just outside of Drumheller, that was built by the Alberta government, was named after Joseph Tyrrell. That's why it's named after him. And again, while you're moving across the prairies, it's very important that you be able to move and how they actually did the work in the 1800s, because they didn't have cars, they didn't have roads, and they didn't have aircraft or anything. So these are the ways in which the field parties traveled. So the Red River carts that were used, you've got moving through the forests and stopping for lunch with these. All of these pictures were taken by Tyrrell. This was an example of a boat rigged with various sails that he could get around Lake Winnipegosis in Manitoba. And this one I thought was quite interesting because it was a dog site that he had as he was leaving Norway House, excuse me, Norway House on the Hudson's Bay region. And they left in the winter time because that was when it was easiest to travel. Otherwise, you're looking at a lot of tundra, and it's very difficult to travel in summertime. This is an example of, I don't know who actually took this picture. It's credited with Joseph Tyrrell, but this is Joseph Tyrrell traveling in style on a lake up in Nunavut. I won't try and pronounce that, but again, he's got his Indigenous Aboriginal guides taking him around in style. So towards the end of the 1900s or 1800s, you've got the railway link across the country. That had been established. You had a lot of people with up in the gold rush in the Klondike, the sourdoughs here, people, how they actually mined. These were all photographs that were taken at various times looking for prosperity. And another issue that was starting to raise it was Canadian sovereignty. Again, this is something that it sounds familiar today, but trying to figure out who owned the Arctic, who had control of the Arctic, and establishing Canadian sovereignty up in the Arctic, especially in the Arctic Islands. In the early 1900s, and I'll get this a little bit more so later on, the voyage of the Neptune was sent around so it could establish the Canadian sovereignty in Labrador up through the Davis Straits and up into the Arctic Islands. Now, Albert Lowe, this is the last person that I'm going to talk about from the late 1800s. Albert Lowe was the person who was put in charge of the Neptune expedition. And these are pictures of the Neptune and the Neptune in winter quarters as it's going through in 1903. The whole Neptune expedition went 1903 to 1905, and they went out of Halifax. They sailed out of Halifax up into the Arctic, and then up into the Arctic Islands, and then back to Halifax. And the collections that were made, and then drawings and the specimens that were collected through this expedition were part of what was called the Canadian Arctic Expedition. And the anniversary of that was, 100th anniversary of that particular expedition was put on a special display by the Canadian Museum of History a few years ago. And they were looking at those particular displays at that time. So as he did a lot of field mapping in what's now northern Labrador and northern Quebec. Fort Chimo is now Kuujjuaq in Ungava Bay. And if you ever look at a map of Quebec, Ungava Bay is the large chunk that's out of the coastline of northern Quebec. And Fort Chimo or Kuujjuaq is there. And this is a picture of what it looked like in the late 1800s. And again, this is a photograph of his field crew, Lowe's field crew. They've actually stopped for lunch, and they're actually doing fishing for their lunch through the ice in that. And in this particular thing, this is, I don't know which one is Lowe and which one is Eaton, but they're hunting for their food. And again, while they're working in northern Labrador, you just can't bring your supplies in. There's no way to get it. You have to do your own work yourself. And again, this is a canoe that they were using when they were doing some of their surveying. This is an actual survey pole that people use while they're trying to make their base maps. So this is a canoe that they were looking on a lake. So by 1913, this was the map of Canada that we had, the Geology Map of Canada. You can see that we've got a lot more detail in this region. We've got an enormous amount of detail where the railways went, and a lot of detail from the region where Dawson had done his work. We have a fair amount of information from the Barren Lands where Tyrrell had done his work. And again, we have a fair amount of information from where Albert Lowe had been doing his work. So the map is becoming more filled in, and people have a better understanding of the geology. And again, all of this was in support of the economic development and expansion of Canada, so that we've got this understanding at this stage, still pretty basic. Some of the things that happened in the early part of the 1900s, as I said, we had a museum that was started by Dawson, or started by Logan, but while George Dawson ended up being the third director of the Geological Survey of Canada, and while he was the director, he secured funding for the building of a museum to house the displays of the Geological Survey of Canada, the public displays. And this was the Victoria Memorial Building. It is still in existence in Ottawa. This is a picture of it a year after its opening. And this is a picture of it in 2002 before the major renovations that were done to bring it up to speed. So this is what the museum looked like in 1912. You have to understand that by this time, the GSC, it had done most of its work. We were just starting to fill in details. And we were going through a lot of cycles of, you've got funding, you don't have funding, you've got a war coming on, you've got people leaving, you've got people, the funding is very, the funding was not always constant, shall we say. But some of the critical things, some of the interesting things that happened in the early part of the 1900s, we did have the first professional woman hired at the GSC. Her name was Alice Wilson. She was hired in 1907 and became a permanent museum assistant in 1911 after she had completed her undergraduate degree from the University of Toronto. She was the first major curator of the National Type Collection of Invertebrate and Plant Fossils. This was the collection that I took over when I moved to Ottawa in 1993. In addition to that, she was also one of these people who was very interested in the world around her, and she wanted to do mapping. But because she was a female, because she was a woman, Dave told me I'm not allowed to use that, female. Anyway, because she was a woman, she was not allowed to go out onto any field parties. So she did what any reasonable person could do. She started to map the area around Ottawa. She went by hand, by foot, and by a bicycle, and eventually she bought herself a car and she did the mapping. And the maps that she produced single-handedly are still usable today with their knowledge. They have been upgraded a little bit, but generally speaking, they're still relevant today. She also received her PhD in 1929. She finally, after many years of asking, was given a scholarship by the Canadian Federation of University Women, people who had some influence, I would say, because many of their husbands were the political powers of the day, and they put pressure on their husbands to allow Alice to go away to do her university PhD at the University of Chicago. I say it that way because she had asked and asked and asked and was never given permission because they needed her as the museum assistant and preparator. And so finally, with a lot of pressure from the Canadian Federation of University Women, she was given permission. She got her PhD in 1929 at the age of 48, and she was not recognized as a geologist until 1936. It was basically 5-6 years later. And the only reason she was given that acknowledgement was that in the mid-1930s, the Bennett government was trying to recognize many of the civil servants, and she was granted the Order of the British Empire, which is equivalent to the Order of Canada today. And at that point, she was still not recognized as a professional geologist. So they embarrassed the GSC in recognizing her as a geologist at that time. So Alice Wilson was really quite a character. I think one of my favorite quotes from her was the fact that if you've encountered an obstruction in the work that you're doing, you should go around it, don't try and go through it. And that's what she did. So this is an example of Alice's work. This is her handwriting, the catalogs that she'd started. This is a container of the catalogs. This particular collection has about 160,000 specimens in it at this point. and she started it. And so these are some of my favorite fossils, as you were, that Alice Wilson was responsible for. In addition, in the 1930s, we didn't have a lot of funding. The Depression was on. There wasn't a lot of field mapping that was going on because of the Depression, but we still got people out. This was a picture of some of the geologists up in Quebec. Their lovely field vehicle got stuck in the mud there, I think. But in 1935, the Bennett government of the day took a leaf out of the Roosevelt's programs in the US, and they actually gave funding, massive funding, for a summer work project for university students. And the GSC got a lot of funding in 1935, and they went from what they thought were going to be 5 or 6 field parties to over 100. And what they did was they had geologists, major geologists, who were managing up to 7 to 10 field parties of university students out doing the work. This, I'd not really heard too much about this, but when I moved to Ottawa, I actually encountered an older gentleman who'd actually been part of those field parties. So it was really quite interesting. Anyway, so to actually manage some of those field parties, some of the geologists took to the air to actually go from one field party to another as they were managing them, because they couldn't do it any other way. They couldn't manage these things. They also did field mapping around the north shore of Lake Superior. And these are the areas that became quite famous by the group of 7 on the bedrocks around, I think it's St. Michael's Lake and stuff in Lake Superior. And then it brought us into the World War, Second World War. There was a fair amount of effort with the GSC, especially in areas of Northwest Territories where they were actually looking for oil and gas for the war effort. We had a lot of geologists who were kept back. Some of the older guys, instead of going overseas, young ones went overseas, but the older ones stayed and did field mapping for the war effort. And after the war, we had a major economic expansion in Canada, and we were basically looking for high demand for fossil fuels, the ores, the coppers, the aggregates, and the limestone for building and making cement. These were all things that we were looking for. We were still trying to get them. And the GSC was one of the main foci for working on this kind of stuff. There weren't that many universities, and the GSC were the people who did the basic regional mapping. And then the mining companies or anybody else could come in and do the detailed mapping and opening up new mines as that was needed. We also took to flight and used it extensively because it gave us the ability to map much more rapidly. So we used, in the upper photograph, you're looking at fixed wing aircraft that with the large tires that allow them to land on the tundra quite easily. We used a lot of helicopters because in the tundra, you don't have a lot of space for takeoffs and landing. So the helicopters really came into their fore in the Arctic work that we had. We also used a lot of airplanes. We developed new survey techniques for air photo and making air photos and doing aeromagnetic surveys. These are techniques that are for what we would refer to now as remote sensing kinds of techniques that you've got. And it was the GSC that was spearheading some of this work in the Arctic. And in 1955, there was what was referred to as Operation Franklin. It was done, headed by a man named Yves Fortier, and he was doing the mapping. But these 3 gentlemen, Tim Tozer, Ray Thorsteinson, and Digby McLaren, were the 3 paleontologists who worked out the biostratigraphic framework for the Arctic islands. And these individuals, we're finally getting to the stage in the talk where these are people that I have met and that I worked with. And in particular, Digby McLaren, I would like to point out that he was one of the directors of the GSC eventually later on in his career. And all of these scientists were extremely well known and well respected in their fields. All of them became Orders of Canada recipients. And Digby McLaren in particular, in 1990, shortly after he retired, he published a book called A Planet Under Stress. And he was one of the first geologists and professional geologists that I knew, paleontologists, who actually recognized the real danger that the planet was suffering as a result of climate change. And he used a lot of his own personal capital, as I call it, or his scientific capital, because a lot of people poo-pooed what he was saying back in the 70s and 80s. But he stuck by his guns and he said, no, we've got trouble. So Digby is somebody that is really quite an interesting individual. All of these men were interesting, but Digby in particular was a little bit more wide-ranging in his interests. So the fieldwork in Arctic in particular is really quite interesting because we used helicopters extensively to move our people and our supplies around. I particularly like this photograph where it shows the juxtaposition of the dog sled teams and the helicopter. and this old bomber was actually reconditioned to actually fly some of the original aeromagnetic surveys that we put out in the 1950s. So this is, I found that those were really quite interesting. The fieldwork in the Arctic is quite dangerous and can be cold and hazardous. Occasionally we use, when it's allowed, when you can, we use skidoos and we use sleds and we use dog teams and we use whatever we can to get out there. A lot of the work that's being done now is actually being done by remote sensing techniques. But at the moment, that's how we were doing it. And this particular shot is one of the geologists that's walking along the shore. He's holding an instrument that's used for, it's called a pogo stick, and it's actually a stick, a 2-meter long stick that is actually in graduation so that you can actually use it to measure a section as you're going along. And this is the state of the geology of Canada as of 1996. It was a map that's this particular map is probably about a meter by three-quarters of a meter in size. And you can see the details that we've got. This is a 1 to 1 million scale map. And you can see that we've worked out a lot of the detail. You've got the Precambrian shield rock in the middle. You've got the lower Paleozoic rocks around the outside of that up into the Arctic Islands. Basically, you're looking at the geology of Canada. The legend that goes along with this map is actually 2 sheets the same size so that you can understand the work that what this map actually shows you. So the details that we have over the 150 years at that point of mapping that people had done, we've gone from virtually nothing through to a fairly detailed map of the country. So with that, I'd like to say thank you for listening, and I welcome any questions you might have.
Well, that was amazing. Thank you very much, Jean. I'd like to start by asking the first question, which is related to the geologic time scale that you showed. And I was wondering if there are any type sections in Canada for major parts of that geologic time scale.
Okay, what Dave is asking, for those of you who don't know, a type section is a section of rock where you actually, anybody from any place in the world can come and look at that section and refer back to that particular section. So they can come and collect material from that area and you can compare it to what you've got in other parts of the world. And the answer to that question is yes. Canada has many different major type sections for especially major time units. There's one be of interest to people who are interested in mass extinctions, if you will. One of the big 5 mass extinctions is the extinction over the Ordovician-Silurian boundary. And the definition of the Ordovician and the Silurian boundary is based on a group of fossils called graptolites. And they are, the type section for graptolites is over in Scandinavia. Graptolites are a particular group of fossils that are found in deep water, which makes it really difficult to tie that in across. So in Canada, we've actually, in Anticosti Island, which is a large island in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, we have exquisite, absolutely exquisite fossil preservation over the Ordovician-Silurian boundary. And it's a near shore section, which is much more, has a much greater utility for people. And as a mass extinction, the Ordovician-Silurian extinction is really quite interesting because it was at a time when there was a major there were glaciations, it was an interglacial period, there was a mass extinction that happened. So it's one of the models. This particular extinction event is a model that is very similar to what potentially could be happening today. So yes, we have that. We have the Burgess Shale in Canada. We have a large number of other major type sections for fossils in the geologic timescale.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to Zach Jacobson for our next question.
Hi, Jean. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Look, this is more anthropological than geological. There was a picture that Dawson had taken, I think, on what I think was a Haida building.
Mm-hmm.
It certainly looked like Western carpentry, and the graphic at the end showed what I would have called Euclidean geometry, like that big, large circle. Comments?
Yeah, as I really don't have much of a comment on how they actually did that work, but the Haida graphics that they did were exquisite, and Dawson was fascinated by them. So he took a large number of photographs of the totems and the stuff that they had, and hence his documentation early on in the contact with this group of people is the documentation that was the foundation of the displays that we've got in the Museum of History here in Gatineau.
Thanks.
Yeah. Other things, well, actually, Dave was also pointing out, he was looking at the museum, the exterior of the Museum of History that was done. David Cardinal was the architect who did it. And there's a couple of views that he saw when you look at the swirls of the museum building on the outside, they actually look like Haida faces. It's quite an interesting way to do it, so that it reflects back a lot on the influence of that particular museum. So.
I noticed that.
Our next question from Ted Manning.
Yeah, just let me respond to Zach as well. If you really like this stuff, go to Smithers. There's absolutely wonderful current day examples of what the Haida and Tlingit and people related to them were able to do. And we didn't own the circle. I think most cultures had it at some point before we discovered it. I'd just like to make the point that I was involved in other surveys through the Lands Directorate and the Ecological Survey of Canada and so on back in the 70s and 80s. And we never had enough money. And the biggest issue I guess I have is now that we've done all of this wonderful mapping and very detailed analysis of what's there, are we extracting money from the people who want to use it for commercial reasons to get at our resources?
In general, no, not to any great degree. You have to buy the maps. The maps are being provided for the public good. The work that the GSC is doing is for public good. Most of it is being done, yes, in direct response to mining and extractive industries, but it is not for their only for their use. So it's not pay for service that the survey does. So it's, I hesitate to say we don't do that, but generally speaking, no, it's for public good science.
Maybe Canada should have equity in a chunk of all of these marvelous finds.
Yes, yes.
Okay, our next question is from John Lake.
Thanks, Dave. Brilliant and very useful, Jean. I wonder whether there is an opportunity to, first of all, I think that with all the work you put into that, it has to be saved and used, it seems to me. And thinking back to my first years in foreign affairs, people who join the Geological Survey of Canada now, it seems to me this should be an afternoon or a day introduction to them to show all the valuable work that's been done. I do have a specific comment, a very narrow one, but what do you think of that as a suggestion?
Well, thank you. This talk actually started from exactly that kind of an idea. I called it my cornerstone talk, and it was basically a probably 10-minute spiel that I gave to people who were coming, anybody who would be interested. I could give this talk to them, and it was basically the cornerstone of Canada, its geology. I then expanded it to a talk that I actually gave several times at the University of Ottawa to the geography department. But generally speaking, this is the first time it's been done in this form that I've got today in probably 10 years. But yeah, it would be fun.
If I were joining, I would be inspired by that. I really would.
Thank you.
Anyway, the specific question was, there was a photo, I would say, somewhere around maybe the 7th or 5th from the end, and it was a photo of particular bands along the Lake Superior and as far as I was concerned, from a very cursory glance at it, it almost looked as though someone had taken a bunch of paintbrushes and painted bands there, but obviously, I guess people had better things to do from that. And that is such I don't know, what's the word? A particular photo. What can you give the explanation of those bands? What is it? Whatever.
Yes, I won't pull it. I won't pull the photo up. But those were the photographs that I said were evocative of the Group of Seven, and that kind of landscape was actually made famous by the Group of Seven, especially around Georgian Bay and Lake Superior and areas like that. It is basically granitic rocks where you've got intrusions of what we refer to as dikes, and this is as I said, timing and understanding how things became, how they got there, understanding the history is really important. And dike swarms are actually warm igneous rock that gets intruded into cold country rock, so that you get these lines that are actually, it's a crack that fills in with other molten material that then cools very slowly. So the geology of the Precambrian shield is very interesting, but it's not something that I know a lot of detail on, and nor do I know exactly where those photographs were taken, other than that they were on the North Shore of Lake Superior. But this rock type has been made famous by the Group of Seven, if you look at them.
Thank you. Okay.
Next question is from Art Hunter.
Yeah, Gene, thank you. I'm just fascinated by that, and I recognize, many of the names of places which are cities in Canada now, and places in the north as well. The one thing that you had talked about in one of your earlier presentations was that rivers follow major fault lines. And of course, my interest in geothermal is always piqued by this. And I was wondering if the GSC has ever done any geothermal mapping.
Yes, there was a project that was done in particular in the 1980s by a man named Alan Jessup. And he was actually doing a lot of work on geothermal in Canada, but in particular, he was looking in Western Canada was a lot of the work that he'd done. And it was not so much mapping for geothermal, but he was actually looking at the possibilities of geothermal energy sources on a large scale. So not necessarily the small scale that you've got, but the work that Alan Jessup did was on geothermal. The other thing that the GSC is doing right now that might be of interest to you in particular is we have a major, listen to me collectively, I've retired from the organization. The major groundwater in mapping the groundwater of Canada, a major initiative that they're doing, looking at the groundwater, the quality of the groundwater, and where you can find it. So there is work going on that is related, that's not necessarily part of the extractive industries, as it were. Yeah.
Thank you.
Ah, good. Mary, you're up.
Hi, Jean. This is interesting. My written question in the chat line is the work that's being done today, surveys and whatever, how does it relate to the very big ongoing discussion, debate, competition for Canadian sovereignty?
There is a major component of the work that the GSC is doing on Canadian sovereignty, especially up in the north, both in terms of on the land, but also in the water. There was a UN UNCLOS, the UN, something about ocean, I can't remember what it stands for. But anyway, the GSC was the major group that was looking at mapping out the continental shelf of the Canadian continental shelf so that you can actually determine where sovereignty of Canadian, a national sovereignty ends and begins, and where the lines go, who has control over particular areas. And UNCLOS, we were actually mapping the Canadian continental shelf region out in the Arctic Islands and making sure that Canadian sovereignty would be there, especially with respect to the Northwest Passage. Once we have ice-free Northwest Passage, it's going to be an interesting time if we have not established our sovereignty. In addition to that, a couple of years ago, I don't know if you guys remember hearing the story about Ham Island and whether or not Canada or Greenland has sovereignty over Ham Island, which is between Greenland and Labrador coast, if you will. And the reason everybody's really interested in Ham Island is both because of the continental shelf question, because it would extend the Danish continental shelf into what we think of as Canadian waters. So who owns Ham Island is important. In addition, there's also a lot of gemstones that they have discovered in those regions. Some beautiful sapphires and emeralds, not emeralds, sapphires and rubies. And there's also in the north now diamond mines, not associated with that. In the Ham Island region and in Labrador, there are some potential gem mines. So yes, sovereignty is a major question still today.
Can I squeeze another question in?
Sure, go ahead.
With the permafrost disappearing, ice disappearing, shorelines being redefined as we talk, is the survey people very relevant to that kind of help? Because people need help. Yes,
yes, they are. The GSC has done a lot of work on permafrost mapping in the north, and there are major maps, again, at the 1:1 million scale that I've shown that show the permafrost regions of Canada. I didn't use those at all, but we do have major programs looking at the permafrost, the quality of it, and what is happening with respect to climate change and the permafrost. So yes, they are doing a lot of mapping in those regions, and also water resources. They are becoming quite aware of the fact that water resources are a major problem. So generally speaking, the GSC, Geological Survey, does regional mapping, and it's up to the individuals to actually do the more detailed mapping in a particular area. So with the examples of mines, it's up to the mining company to take the information that the GSC provides and do their own detailed mapping. But when it comes to things like groundwater, it's not something that's, it's more regional than it is very much local. So we do the mapping at the regional scale, and the same thing is true for permafrost and looking at how the permafrost reacts as it's thawing. So yeah, that's the work that we do. And monitoring
Thank
it.
you.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Great, great, great news.
Thank you. And next up, we've got Cameron.
Hi, Jean. This is probably a follow-up to Mr. Manning's question. I was wondering if we have a percentage of resources that have been extracted via these geological survey maps, or is that too like immeasurable of a question?
Actually, it's it's interesting that you should ask that question. As I said, we do the regional mapping and other people are responsible for coming in and finding things. But because the extraction industries in particular are so important, we're still hewers of natural resources, we're pulling things out. And because that is so important to the economy, the GSC work has become so integral to that they don't really keep track too much. They've tried to do it. And when we started to show our political masters that, the work that we've done has resulted in X number of millions or billions of dollars of economic development and growth, the political masters didn't believe us because we were so inexpensive relative to the importance of our work to the economy that they just didn't believe that that's what we were doing. So to answer your question more directly, do we keep track of it? We've tried, but it's almost impossible, and people just don't believe how economic the GSC is to our economic growth and stability.
Thank you for that, Jean.
Right, I was a little slow on the mark there. Bill Pugsley, you're next.
There we go. Thank you very much, Jean. Your mention of several dates made me think thoughtfully about the beginning of the Weather Service, the Met Service, which also started in 1842. So it was a good year. My question has to do with a thing that was called the Gravity Survey of Canada that I happened to be involved with for 2 years in the late 50s. And it covered, it consisted of flying in helicopters and taking a very precise measurement of gravity and gravity anomalies at about 8 mile or 10 kilometer intervals over all of Baffin Island one summer, and the other summer was northern Saskatchewan and the Northwest Territories. Right. At the time, this was done under the organization of the Dominion Observatory, which had a gravity division, and both that and Geological Survey were both under what was called the Mines and Technical Surveys Department. So I have not heard anything about whatever happened to that Gravity Survey of Canada, but I know at the time there was much excitement by people with geophysics backgrounds about identifying fossil craters such as Ungava up in the northern part of Quebec, and even one I think we found in Baffin Island, as well as, and more in the national interest, identifying underlying differing densities of minerals and gas and oil that would cover the north. So my real question is, did the GSC take this over, and what happened to it, the program?
The short answer to your question is eventually yes. We were involved in the surveys in the 50s. Yes, there were a lot of people in the what became the Earth Physics branch and the geophysics groups of the Earth Physics branch who did the gravity and the magnetic anomaly surveys that you're talking about. But back in, it was about I can't remember exactly when, 1989, those branches were merged back into the GSC. So yes, all of that work is still ongoing with the GSC, and they use the gravity surveys extensively for trying to identify mines and so on, as you were mentioning. So yes, the GSC has that under its wing again. Yeah.
Also, I should note that Digby McLaren was the chair of the Club of Rome around in the early 90s, as I recall, about the time I joined.
Okay, excellent. That I didn't know.
So, sorry, that was the chairman of the Club of Rome or the chairman of KCOR?
Oh, no, of KCOR.
Okay.
He also became, I think, the president of the Royal Society in that time too after he retired. But I thought for a while, I'm pretty sure he was the head of KCOR and then moved on to other things, but for a short time there.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise.
That's true, Bill. When I very first joined, he was the chair. That was a long, long time ago.
And he was the chair when I joined as well.
Mhm.
So we're going to go back to John Legg for another question. And if anybody has a final question, please put it up.
Thank you again, David. I wonder, Gene, whether there has been recently a gathering of all the various departmental contributions to the sovereignty effort. I do remember, and I ran across his name recently, Beasley was the name. There used to be, and there's still I would call it a treasure trove of specialist lawyers within global affairs in the law of the sea section. And that fellow Beasley, I noticed that his name is on a scholarship or something. And it just seems to me that this is typically Canadian. You have all these efforts, all of which are impressive, but they're all off on their own. And it just seems to me that I hope that someone is drawing all this together. And this, of course, is one major part of it. And the law of the sea specialization within global affairs, that would be another. And I'm sure there are many others. Do you know whether there's interdepartmental work in this area?
Especially with respect to the law of the sea, the UNCLOS was the UN attempt that I was talking about, and that was spearheaded by Natural Resources Canada, and in particular the Geological Survey of Canada. A man named Jacob Verhoef was the person who ran that for us. And he, in terms of the law of the sea, that was the particularly important one. In terms of other, I know that there was a lot of interdepartmental work on that, but it was being spearheaded by our department simply because we have the expertise on defining a continental shelf and the ability to do the remote sensing and the equipment that was needed and the expertise, the scientific expertise for that. And I know that they had other people in, I do not know if there are other efforts in sovereignty that are like that. I'm not aware of them.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, we don't have any more questions lined up, so I want to thank you again, Gene. It was a wonderful talk, and I guess we'll have to continue being partners in major crimes and misdemeanors.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Well done.